looks pretty overwhelming as usual to start with, but we've probably gotten pretty good at identifying the different variables that are across the top here. We know that our effect size is our weighted mean, or D, and the standard error is the amount of variability around that effect size. We know the confidence interval is what we can use to try to identify whether that is significant or not. And we know the Q and Z tests refer to the heterogeneity of this particular intervention. What we've got here is the effect of the exercise program on the treatment group versus the control group. And you can see that overall the effect on well-being is higher for the treatment groups than the control group, with 0.24 for the treatment group and 0.09 for the control. There were stronger effects for people who were considered late middle age than there were for people who were old, as they called it. The definition of those categories is available in the methods section. The benefits towards well-being were stronger when people's cardiovascular fitness improved, as well as when their strength training improved, and when their flexibility improved. These people are probably more likely to have an improvement in their well-being due to the higher level of adherence. As we can see from the next row down, people who were sedentary to start with got a bigger improvement in well-being compared to those who weren't sedentary and were already active. And then we can have a look at the effect sizes here for the different exercise types available. The type of exercise with the strongest effect size on well-being is the one that's also the most studied, aerobic exercise, with an effect size of 0.29. Resistance training also had a significant effect on well-being at 0.23. Aerobic calisthenics wasn't significant, but aerobic calisthenics with a resistive component was significant and had a small effect size of 0.17. This was followed closely by calisthenics alone of 0.15. If we look at the influence of exercise intensity on people's improvements in well-being, we can see that the strongest effect sizes are for people who are doing moderate levels of physical activity. You actually get less improvements in well-being when people are doing vigorous or hard exercise. This is seen in the effect sizes of 0.34 versus the effect size of 0.26. Now the last one is where things get a little bit complicated because this is the measure of well-being. If we look at something like anger, you can see that there is a significant effect size here. The problem is when you go across to the control conditions, there's also a significant effect size for the people who don't receive any intervention. That means regardless of whether someone does exercise or not, they still seem to get a reduction in anger. Anxiety, on the other hand, seems to only get a reduction when people start to engage in physical activity. There's a significant effect size for those who are in the treatment group, but no significant difference for the people who aren't. For confusion, the effect size is exactly the same. You hardly get any benefit for being in the treatment group versus the control condition. For depression, there's a good effect size when someone's in the treatment group, but there's also a significant reduction in depression for people in the control condition of 0.19. And the same for energy. People get a modest improvement in energy by being in a treatment group, but they also get half that improvement when they're in the control group. So the way to manage this is probably to look at the difference in effect sizes here. The one with the biggest difference in effect sizes is anxiety, with the difference being 0.24. The next largest would be anger, with a difference of 0.12. Energy is the same with 0.12. Depression would be next with 0.10. And there's no effect for confusion. There's one slightly more complicated table here, which I didn't ask you to digest on your own because it's a little bit different to the ones that we've studied before. This one is using a regression, which means instead of looking at a treatment versus a control, what they're looking at is maybe a higher length of a treatment versus a higher level of anxiety or depression, or number of sessions versus the number of events. So to explain how this works, if you look at the control group along the top, for example, you can see a significant Z for the number of weeks. Even though it's very, very small, you'd say that the longer someone's in a control condition, the lower their well-being. But if you have a look at the treatment condition, the longer they're in the treatment condition, the lower their well-being. Both of these are significant. And this might mean, even though the effect sizes are very small, as people age, due to the increasing levels of disability that can happen, it does look like the deeper that people go into old age, the lower their well-being. So the longer the treatment programs here, the less the improvements in things like anxiety, depression, and self-efficacy. This is a bit interesting because generally you'd expect a longer treatment to be more effective. So the way they describe this in the paper is that even short bouts of physical activity or short-term programs can have an improvement on people's well-being, their anxiety, their depression, and their self-efficacy. And that longer programs aren't necessary for people to be able to identify the physical benefits. If we look at the number of sessions, on the other hand, it does seem like more frequent sessions are better for things like anxiety and self-efficacy. And increasing in number of sessions leads to better anxiety and higher self-efficacy. So it's not necessarily a long program that's important, but just one that has high frequency. And there's a very, very small effect size here between anxiety and the number of minutes, meaning that a longer program was better for people at improving their anxiety. But generally, the strongest effect sizes here are for the frequency of the session, not necessarily the length of the program in the number of weeks. So that was a big table for us to digest, but let's see what we learnt from it. I'm going to ask you a few kind of true or false questions down below, and I want you to identify what do you think the answers are. Then we're going to go on and talk about a few case studies that wrap up everything about the course.